Welcome back to ABA Beyond the Data. I'm your host, Jay Burton, BCBA, and the dad of two awesome boys who just happen to be on the spectrum. This show is designed for behavior analysts who are looking to bridge the latest research to our professional practices, and it is dedicated to providing practical solutions to the practicing clinician. And we're going to start this episode with just a little bit of time travel as I take you back into my very early career as a behavior technician. Picture this: a tiny therapy room, a tiny little table, a tiny chair, and a tiny little 2-year-old sitting across from me at this table. On the table, a stack of laminated picture cards, a data sheet on a clipboard, you remember those paper days, and a small pile of edibles off to the side. It's classic early 2000s ABA vibes. I'm running touch nose, touch head, where's the ball, all the greatest hits of classic DTT. I'm delivering my SDs just like I was trained. I'm keeping my inter-trial intervals short. I'm marking pluses and minuses on paper data sheets. From the outside, it probably looked like textbook discrete trial training. But if you zoomed in on the actual human in front of me, the child, here's what you would have seen. He's slumped in his chair, eyes flickering towards the door every few seconds. His little legs are kicking under the table. Every time I say touch nose, his body tenses just a bit. It's not a meltdown. It's not severe problem behaviors. It's that quiet, miserable kind of non-compliance where a kid has basically checked out but is still physically there and physically complying. And maybe today is observation day. The parents are across the room watching. They're trying so hard to look encouraging, but I can see it in their face. This does not look like what they imagined when someone told them early intervention and evidence-based treatment. I'm trying to be upbeat and engaging. I'm praising, I'm reinforcing. I'm also sweating through my shirt and silently thinking, if I'm this exhausted and feeling this much pressure in front of the parents in just a 30-minute trial, what does it feel like for him after 20 hours a week of this? Now, fast forward a few years, same general age range of a client, but now I'm on the floor, no tiny table. I've got a bin of blocks, some cars, maybe a Mickey Mouse toy because, let's be honest, Mickey Mouse runs the toddler world. This is his show. Instead of starting with touch nose, I start by just watching. What is he drawn to? Does he go straight for the cars? Does he line them up? Does he crash them? Does he look back at me to see if I'm paying attention? And when I see that flicker of interest, that, what's this guy doing here look, that's when I jump in. If he's lining up cars, I'm lining up cars. If he's crashing cars, you better bet I'm crashing cars. And as he gets familiar with me and the way I'm engaging and playing with him, I start to add in a few little things. Ready, set, he says go, or I fill in the blank for him, just so that he can start to get used to the routine. And boom, the cars crash, and I add in a big sound. And he just happens to copy my boom. And I go with excitement in. Yeah, boom. I copy him. I get that smile from him that we all seek from this age range, right? And I'm hooked in at this point. I've got him. I've got him where I need him because now I'm doing 3 or 4 or 5 or 10. Ready, set, and he's saying go. And he's so excited when he sees the crash and the boom. And I start to move away just a little bit, and that's when I see him reaching towards me because he still wants to keep playing. And I push in the approximation of more. And he says, "Muh." And boy, do you believe it that I am back to crashing cars, back to ready, set, go, back to the big boom. I'm teaching mans, shaping vocals, working on play skills, all while this is being embedded in a fun, more natural way of learning. And here's the wild part: the learning that is occurring here actually sticks better. The child is engaged, he's looking at me, he's initiating. And when I talk to the parents afterward, they say things like, "Oh, we can actually do that with him," or, "Oh my gosh, he loves playing with you. He loves playing that way. I can't wait to do it too." So the question you should ask yourself: what changed? Because the science of behavior didn't change. Reinforcement is still reinforcement, motivation is still motivation. Prompting and shaping and generalization all still matter. What changed was how I was applying the science, what I paid attention to developmentally, and how I wove it into play and daily life instead of making kids come to my little table world. And that brings us to our focus for this episode: naturalistic developmental behavior interventions, or better known as NDBIs. You've probably heard that acronym floating around, maybe attach it to a specific model like Early Start Denver model, or maybe in a policy document, or maybe in a conversation with an SLP who swears she doesn't do ABA, but is clearly using about half of these strategies, right? NDBIs are basically a family of interventions that intentionally blend ABA with developmental science. They're delivered in natural settings: living rooms, preschools, playgrounds, kitchen tables. They lean heavily on shared control between the child and the adult. The child's interests and choices drive the activities, and the adult brings the structure, the goals, and the teaching opportunities. They rely on natural consequences. If you communicate, you get more of the things you're communicating about. And they're very focused on teaching skills that are developmentally appropriate: social, communication, play, imitation, joint attention, early language, adaptive skills. The things that truly matter, especially in early intervention. So, in this episode, I want to slow this down and really unpack it. We're going to talk about what NDBIs actually are, not just the buzzword version, right? Not just the, oh, it's a naturalistic teaching. I want to go beyond that. I want to talk about what if you walk into session in one of these NDBI clinics, what are you going to see? We're going to look at what the research says about the different NDBI models, with a special focus on the Early Start Denver model, because that's the one I personally know best. It's the one I've practiced the most. We're going to break down the common components, the ingredients that show up over and over again, no matter what brand name you put on it. We're also going to answer the question of whether this is actually ABA or not, or is it something that has evolved from us? And then we're going to get to the super practical standpoint that we always want to end on with this show. We're going to talk about how you can bring NDBI principles into everyday ABA practices, even if you work in a clinic that is very table time heavy right now. All right. As a reminder, this show is A certified to provide CEUs to BCBAs, BCABAs, BCBADs, if they're out there listening, and starting in 2026 for you RBTs to get your professional developmental units, which, whew, that's a whole new thing y'all got to be worried about, right? And let's remember how this all works. At 3 different points in this episode, I'm going to drop a keyword. If you want a CEU credit, you go to aba-ceus.com after you listen. Find this episode in the Get CEUs tab, and you'll enter those 3 key words. And of course, just pay and you get your certificate in about 24 hours. So whether you're a BCBA, an RBT, a grad student, a therapist from another discipline, or a parent just trying to make sense of all these different ABA models out there, pull up a chair. Or better yet, let's get down on the floor with a few of our favorite toys. So, before we start talking about specific models and treatment packages, let's slow down and answer the really basic question. What exactly are naturalistic developmental behavior interventions? Because NDBIs honestly sound very technical. But what it describes is actually something a lot of you are already doing, or at least moving towards. We're moving towards it as a field, for sure. And the term naturalistic developmental behavior and interventions, NDBIs, did not have a universal consensus of what it actually was or what it really meant until a paper was published by Laura Schriebman and a whole group of big names in autism research. They were looking around the field and realizing that a bunch of different labs had independently built early intervention programs that looked surprisingly similar, even though they had different names. All of these packages were working with very young kids on the spectrum, and they were grounded in ABA, but they were happening in play fashion. They were occurring in daily routines and in real environments instead of the tiny table world that a lot of ABA exists in. So they got everyone together, everybody from these different organizations, from these different packages, and a whole bunch of big name researchers, and said, let's come together and define this cluster of interventions and see what is truly common about them. And of course, like every good researcher, they said, let's also write a paper on it and get it published. And in that paper, they describe NDBIs as early intervention approaches that are delivered in everyday settings. That can mean your therapy room that looks like a preschool classroom, but it can also mean the family living room, the backyard, the kitchen during snack time, or a community daycare. The idea is that teaching is happening where kids actually live their lives, not in artificial settings that you later have to generalize from. These interventions are built around shared control between the adult and the child. That phrase, shared control, is important. It doesn't mean that the child runs the session and the adult is just hanging out. And it also doesn't mean that the adult is running a rigid script while the child is dragged along. It means the child's interests, choices are driving the activities, and the adult is weaving in structure and goals and teaching opportunities into those activities. They also put a big emphasis on natural contingencies. In classic table time ABA, it's very easy to fall into what we might call arbitrary reinforcement. You say the right word, you get a skill. You touch the correct picture, you get a chip or your toy. In NDBIs, the consequence is usually directly tied to the behavior we want to increase. If I say car, I get the car. If I look at you and reach, you do a silly action again. If I imitate your block tower, you react excitedly. The reinforcement is built into the interaction itself. And this makes generalization a whole lot easier because the reason they are using this skill is because it's built in. And under the hood of NDBIs is still behavioral interventions. They use prompting, shaping, chaining, differential reinforcement, extinction for some things, all of the same core ABA tools. They still explicitly rely on three-term contingencies, antecedent, behavior, consequence, but embedding that contingency into naturalistic and play-based routines. You still have clear opportunities to respond. You still have systematic prompting and prompt fading. You still have data and progress monitoring. You're just wrapping those things around developmentally appropriate targets like joint attention, early play, imitation, early language, and you're doing it in context that makes sense to the child and to the skill itself. So when people ask, are NDBIs like the early Start Denver model actually still ABA? The answer is absolutely. Absolutely. These are interventions derived from behavioral principles, using behavioral teaching strategies, evaluated with the same kind of single case and randomized trial designs we use for everything in our science. They just deliberately incorporate developmental science and natural contexts. And to understand why NDBIs emerged, it helps to zoom out and look at the history. If you look back in the 1960s and 70s, a lot of the groundbreaking work in autism interventions were incredibly structured. Lavos, Furster, and others were using operant methods to show for the first time that children on the spectrum could absolutely learn new skills, and that was huge. They did it with very clear, discrete trials, though, highly controlled environments, and very powerful reinforcers. For a long time, that was the dominant image of ABA. Massed trials at table, repeated over and over and over, often 20, 30, 40 hours a week. But as that work matured, people started asking harder questions about what happened outside of those structured sessions. Were kids able to use those skills spontaneously with peers in the classrooms at home? Did language learned at the table sound natural when they talked to their parents? And what were the side effects of spending so many hours in a highly controlled setting? Research started to highlight exactly what a lot of us have seen clinically. Highly structured only interventions can produce gains, but generalization can be limited. Escape and avoidance behaviors can be extremely high, and you sometimes end up with prompt dependency and rigid responding. And at the same time that Lavos and others were making these leaps and bound discoveries with autism interventions, developmental psychologists and autism researchers in the world were also making big discoveries about how young children learn in the first place. They were studying things like joint attention, where a toddler points to something out or looks back and forth between an object and an adult. They were studying imitation, symbolic play, shared positive affects. They weren't thinking in terms of programming or targets, but they were very clearly mapping out the developmental building blocks that predict language growth and social understanding. And one key theme from that side of literature is that young kids learn best in effectively rich back and forth interactions. Think like peekaboo games or tickle games or sharing a book to read, and not in isolated drills. What NDBIs represent are these two streams finally acknowledging each other and coming together. On one side, you have applied behavioral analysis bringing a powerful toolkit for building and measuring behavior change. On the other side, you have developmental science saying, here's how typical development unfolds, and here's what seems to matter most in the first few years of life. NDBIs sit right there in the middle. They intentionally merge those two using behavioral principles to systematically teach skills that developmentally are critical. And referring back to that paper from earlier, Schreiber and colleagues make the point that NDBIs are not one specific program. They are a class of interventions that share certain features. If you look at the examples they provide, it is like reading the greatest hits of early autism intervention. You've got incidental teaching, pivotal response training, and of course, the early start Denver model, as well as enhanced Milu teaching, reciprocal imitation training, Project Impact, Jasper, Skirts, Early Achievements, and others. These are interventions that came out of different labs, used slightly different terminology, and sometimes lived in completely different professions. But when you look under the hood, they all share those naturalistic, developmental, and behavioral ingredients. So if we rattle off just a few to put the names with concepts, you've got the Early Start Denver model, which is a comprehensive early intervention program that targets a wide range of developmental domains for toddlers and preschoolers, embedding those targets into structured play and daily routines with heavy emphasis on relationships and positive affects. And then you've got pivotal response training, which focuses on pivotal behaviors like motivation and responsiveness to multiple cues. And then you've got Jasper, which stands for joint attention, symbolic play, engagement, and regulation, which zooms in on social communication, joint attention, and play again using naturalistic interactions and child led play as context. And then there's the enhanced Mailu teaching, which leans into functional communication and language using modeling, expansion, and environmental arrangements in everyday routines. And then you've got Project Impact and programs like Social ABCs, which are explicitly parent mediated NDBIs, where the whole idea is to teach caregivers these strategies so that therapy basically wraps around the child's entire day. Now, who are these interventions designed for? In the original NDBI papers, the focus is very clearly on very young children with autism, toddlers, and preschoolers. Most of the studies involve children from around 12 months up to about 48 months of age, at least at the start of intervention. Sometimes maybe stretching a little bit older, but not by much. And the reason is pretty intuitive. This is a developmentally critical window where those key social communication and play skills are emerging, and where early intensive support seems to have the biggest impact. We've seen this across research. It does not matter which research area you're looking at. We know early intervention is most effective. That said, the fact that NDBIs were designed for toddlers doesn't mean the principles only apply to toddlers. If you've got a 6-year-old who still doesn't initiate joint attention, or a 10-year-old who's never really had a chance to experience joyful reciprocal play, the logic of teaching those skills in natural context with shared control and a natural reinforcement still holds. The developmental age of the skill might matter more than the chronological age itself. And there is a bit of research backing this up, especially in NDBI papers, which show that teaching skills at the child's developmental level rather than solely at their chronological age leads to better acquisition and generalization. All right, so now that we've defined what NDBIs are, let's talk about the question everybody really cares about, which is, do they actually work? So let's zoom in on one specific NDBI that we're going to keep coming back to in this episode: the Early Start Denver model, or ESDM. The Dawson and colleagues randomized control trial is kind of the flagship of ESDM studies. In that study, they enrolled toddlers between 18 months and 30 months who had a diagnosis of autism. Families were randomly assigned to one of the two groups. One group received intensive ESDM for about 2 years, delivered by trained therapists with a strong parent involvement component. The other group received community services as usual type format, which might include a mix of speech, OT, generic early interventions from the state, or ABA, but not a structured NDBI package ABA. And when the study was completed and they compared the results, the kids that received intensive ESDM, Early Start Denver model services, showed significantly greater gains in IQ and adaptive behavior compared to those that received typical services. And it's pretty plain when you look at the graphs within those studies. Their overall cognitive scores increased more rapidly, their language scores increased more rapidly, their daily living and socialization skills increased more rapidly. I mean, just across the board, their skills increased at a much higher rate. Of course, ESDM isn't the only NDBI with a decent research base behind it. If we pan back out and look at other majors models, we see a similar pattern across the research: generally positive, statistically significant effects in the domains they're designed to target, with variability at the edges, but for the most part, pretty significant increases. So, this is really not a fringe idea. This is a pretty well established intervention group, and there is a substantial body of evidence showing that As a class, these interventions support meaningful improvements in language, cognition, play, and social communication for young children on the spectrum. All right, guys, we're going to pause right there. I'm going to drop your first keyword for your CEUs. Your first keyword is play. That's Play. Play. Pretty simple, guys. Play. Write that down somewhere safe if you're planning to get that CEU for this episode. Now we've thoroughly got an understanding of what NDBIs are. We've talked about the history of where they came from, and we've seen a little bit of what the research says. I want to zoom in on what they actually look like in practice. If you walked into a room where someone was running a true NDBI session, what would tip you off that that is what you're seeing? What are the ingredients that show up again and again, even when the brand name changes? This question is exactly what Schriebman and her colleagues were trying to answer when they pulled together that original NDBI paper. They looked across a whole bunch of different intervention models and said, okay, what do these have in common? We define NDBIs as being grounded in three-term contingencies of antecedent behavior and consequences, guided by manuals, monitored with fidelity checks, individualized in their goals, and driven by ongoing progress monitoring. And then beyond that backbone, they are described as a set of features you hear us coming back to over and over. Child initiated teaching episodes, arranging the environment to promote interactions, focusing on intrinsic reinforcement and natural contingencies. So let's walk through those core ideas in plain language, give you a toddler session example for each one, and then give you a little Monday morning BCBA note so you can picture how to coach your staff around it. Let's start with environmental arrangement and child choice. Across NDBIs, there's this idea that the room should be doing a lot of the work for you. In practice, that means we don't just throw every toy on the floor and hope for the best. You might have a highly preferred item like bubbles or cars or snacks, visible but not freely accessible. Maybe they're in clear bins on a shelf at the child's eye level or just out of reach. Or they need help to open them. You're not creating frustration just to create it, but you are designing a space so a natural I need you moment is going to happen. When a toddler toddles over, looks at the bubbles, and then glances back at you, you've just created a beautiful opportunity to teach a gesture, a vocalization, or a sign, or even a picture exchange, or whatever communication you're targeting, right? And yeah, we talk about environmental arrangement all the time in clinics, but are we actually doing it? When you go to a clinic room and you actually look around, have you arranged the environment in a way that truly invites for communication? If you stopped talking, would the environment still invite communication? If the answer is no, if everything is either locked in cabinets or scattered so freely that the child doesn't need anyone, then there's some environmental work that needs to be done. Coaching your RBTs can be as simple as having them do a quick temptation audit at the start of each session. What's visible, what's motivating, and what will naturally pull the child into a shared space with us. The second big element is following the child's lead and sharing control. This includes child initiated teaching episodes and adult imitating the child's actions and communication attempts. Imagine a little 2-year-old who goes straight for the cars and starts rolling them back and forth. A traditional, more rigid approach might look like, okay, cars are a reinforcer. I'm going to lure him over and I'm going to ask him a few questions after I've removed it. Maybe I'm going to do matching and then I'm going to give it back to him. But in an NDBI session, we're probably going to sit on the floor with him, pick up another car, and join that play. Maybe we roll the cars toward him, pause, and see if he looks up. Maybe we build a little routine where we say ready, set, and wait for him to say go before we crash them together and make a big bang. The child is choosing the activity, we're choosing the embedded inside it. Turn taking, simple mands, joint attention bids, those sorts of things being built right into it. If everything in session is being initiated by the adult, the play activities, the share activities, all of it, then it is not truly following the child's lead. You can have your RBTs practice narrating what a child is doing before they give any instructions. If they can't describe what the child is interested in, they're probably not following well enough to build on it. Okay, moving into the third element, which is natural reinforcement. It's about a focus on intrinsic reinforcement and natural contingencies rather than relying on artificial rewards. We try to make the consequences for behavior directly tied to the skills we're teaching and the context it lives in. If a child says car, they should get the car. If they point to bubbles and look at you, you blow the bubbles. If they take your hand and pull you towards the swing, you help them onto the swing and give a push. The reinforcer is built into the routine. It makes intuitive sense to the child, and honestly, to us as well. And natural doesn't mean we never use a token board or an edible, it means those aren't the defaults. They're tools we layer in when necessary, not as an engine for the whole system. And I think that's a huge critical difference against traditional ABA and more naturalistic NDBI versions. All right, and the fourth element is balancing teaching opportunities and prompting. This includes using prompting and prompt fading so that the child moves towards independent skills faster. In a good NDBI session, you're going to see a lot of little teaching moments, brief trials embedded in play rather than long, drawn out drills. An adult might set up a 10 quick opportunity trial or scenario for a child to request more within like a silly game that they're playing, like tickle game or chase or something along those lines. Each time giving just enough help to be successful and then backing off rapidly. When the child starts to anticipate the pattern, the adult fades to a pause and to an expected look, waiting to see if the child will do it on their own. And this is really counter to what like classical ABA is doing out there, where it's like, okay, 3 seconds have gone by, let's go ahead and prompt. I mean, we absolutely, at least good BCBAs, are using time delays as a prompt, but many classically trained BCBAs are not. So a huge aspect in NDBIs is waiting for that natural opportunity to occur, building in just enough prompts to get correct responses, and then fading it out as rapidly as possible, as quick as you see them to start to understand the patterns of getting reinforcement. And we can watch how staff are prompting and watch how quickly they fade. If you see 3 consecutive hand over hand prompts for the same skill, then something's off. In supervision, you can model the idea of the lightest effective prompt. I often say least intrusive, most effective, and rehearse specific fading plans. Maybe we go from a full verbal model to a partial prompt to just a visual or a pause. And if you realize there are almost no clear teaching episodes happening, just vague chatting and play, it's time to tighten up structure without losing the natural context. All right, and the fifth core piece is modeling, expansion, and responsive communication. All of that together. Developmental science tells us that kids learn language and social skills in sweet spots, just above what they can already do, their zone of proximal development. Now, this is really critical to understand. NDBIs stick strongly to the developmental stages as the child develops through them. They do not jump over them. They do not skip developmental stages. They do not skip developmental skills. They work just above the zone, the skill zone that the child is in. To do this, NDBIs have created an operation by having the adults imitate the child, respond contingently, and then nudge the skills forward through modeling and expansion. So picture it like this: a toddler who looks at a ball and says, "Ball." A responsive adult in an NDBI session might pick up on that immediately. Ball, big ball, while rolling it back and forth. If the child bangs blocks together, the adult might imitate the banging, then stack two blocks and say, "Up, up," inviting the child to copy. Every time the child gives you even a tiny piece of communication, you treat it as meaningful and build on it. This is huge. I say this to my staff all the time. Recognize communication even if you don't fully understand what it's going for, but at least recognize the vocalizations and do your best to build on it. You can have your staff practice this through a simple listen, echo, expand rule during certain parts of the session. First, they listen for any vocalizations or gestures or looks. Then they echo it back, especially for kids who are still emerging in expressive language. Then they add just a little bit, another word, a slightly different action, a new idea, and a play theme. If all you ever hear from the staff is instructions and corrections, you're missing this huge modeling engine that NDBIs rely on. All those other common elements are great and all, but I really love this one because like building on language is so important. So if you take nothing else away from this hour-long podcast, the listen, echo, then expand, take that back to home or, well, I guess your clinics and put that into practice. I swear by it. It is one of the best practices in NDBI and one of the best interventions for developing communication and getting children to start speaking. And finally, let's talk about positive affects in our sessions. The basic idea is that therapy should look and feel like a back and forth game, not like a quiz, not like school, especially for early intervention where they learn best through play. The adult is emotionally present. There is shared enjoyment. If you're not having fun, they're not having fun. In a toddler session, that might look like exaggerated facial expressions, silly voices, and genuine laughter when a child does something unexpected and funny. I mean, think of like Miss Rachel. That's what you want in your sessions. I know that sounds silly, but that is what we need with our young ones. We need those exaggerated facial expressions. We need those silly voices. And for early learners, it looks like we're just waiting for a eye contact or a smile to continue. It's that sense that the therapist and the child are in this together, not on opposite sides of a work table. And as a BCBA, you can actually script this into your feedback. And I know newer BCBAs, you can be so nervous about giving feedback, but it's okay to tell your RBT, I want your affect to be more on top of it. I want it to be higher here. I want it to be more engaged, enthusiastic, silly. Or when he glances at you, I want you to engage with a little smile. That's your cue to light up when they smile at you. And on the flip side, you got those RBTs that sometimes come in way too strong and overstimulate the child or overwhelm them, and you can see the child literally pulling back from them. Don't be afraid to let them know. Let them know that they are not having a positive affect on that child, even though they are giving all of that energy. You need to pull it back for that kid. Positive affect doesn't always mean loud, it can mean just genuinely attentive, attuned, and warm and welcoming. And when we step back and look at all these elements together, environmental arrangement and child choices, following the child's lead and sharing control, natural reinforcement, balancing teaching and prompting, rich modeling, expansion, and positive affects, you can probably hear echoes of our earlier episodes on assent and trauma informed care. A session built around these components is one where the child's voice and their preferences matter. That's the heart of NDBI. It's not just that they're naturalistic or that they're early intervention flavored. It's that their core element lines up with both the science of learning and the ethics of how we want to treat kids, with safety, with choices, and with the kind of relational engagement that makes going to therapy look an awful lot like playing and learning with someone who genuinely enjoys being with you. All right, so let's zoom in on one specific NDBI for a bit, the Early Start Denver model, or ESDM for short. I want to be transparent about why I'm spotlighting this one. It's the model I've personally spent the most time researching, the model that I've personally implemented, and the one to me that really pulls all the elements of NDBI together well. It's also one of the most heavily studied NDBIs as it is one of the older ones. When people talk about randomized controlled trials showing gains in cognition, language, and adaptive behavior for young autistic children in the naturalistic model, a lot of that conversation is anchored to literature around the ESDM model. All right, so big picture first. ESDM is an early intervention approach designed for young children with autism between about 12 months to 48 months of age, so very early age intervention. It's built on a manualized set of treatment procedures with a comprehensive curriculum, which is one of the aspects that I love so much. This spans multiple developmental domains: communication, social skills, play, fine motor, and gross motor skills. It also has cognition and adaptive behaviors. Under the hood, it very explicitly combines ABA with developmental and relationship based approaches. And it is the curriculum that really guides the individualization of the client programs. Before you even start treatment, you complete a comprehensive assessment that maps directly onto that curriculum. You then take that curriculum and set up a schedule for that client to follow, a visual schedule. And if you've heard my other podcasts, you know I love visual schedules. I will talk about them all day, every day. Every clinic should be running clinic-wide schedules. I mean, go to my Teach episode if you want to hear more about me just rant on for an hour or two about how important visual schedules are. But yes, they're critical. And ESDM finds no difference there. They are still critical, though it is a little bit more focused on natural and more fun activities than you might have in older kids using the Teach model. And their day is broken up into like 10 to 20-minute intervals of different scheduled activities. So let's make this a little bit more, well, a little less abstract and imagine what a simple 15-minute ESDM style block might actually look like. So, an experience that I had recently is with one of my younger learners. We were in our clinic's playroom and the kiddo was really oriented towards the blocks that were in front of him. And he was doing just lining them up, putting them in some sort of order that I really didn't understand, but I moved into it as well, started putting them in order with him of some sort. He was correcting it as I was going, and that was fine. And then I started to stack a few of these blocks up. I would then knock it over and go boom. And he would just go every single time, just make this little gas like, and then eventually I started going boom and uh-oh, they fell over. And he started picking up with that, right? So I would stack up a few blocks. He or I would knock him over. He eventually started actually knocking them over with me. I would say boom, and then he eventually started saying uh-oh, either with me or right afterwards. And I love this interaction that we were having. It was so naturally occurring during this moment. It was a beautiful little moment. But this is exactly what ESDM moments look like. We're building in communication, we're building in natural opportunities to work on communication skills. And as we kept playing, I eventually had him start stacking it and requesting my turn for the blocks. He was not as vocal as many other individuals his age, but he was able to start pretty rapidly making the my turn type of sign, patting his chest to say my turn. And within, I don't know, 5 minutes maybe of doing this pretty repetitively, but at the same time making it fun by going boom with the block, stacking them up, and going, uh-oh, which he was just loving that whole chain. He pretty rapidly got the my turn built into it. So this kiddo who's new to our clinic, and honestly, I was just jumping in because we were a little shorthand staff that day, and so I jumped in. I was able to, in 15 minutes, work on turn taking, echoic targets, intraverbal skills, stacking, imitation with objects, all of these in just a few minutes. And then about the 15-minute mark, we headed over to the next location, which was gym time. And in that location, I got him to start working on saying chase. And this is a kid that, according to parents, had very little to no vocalizations. And within just a few minutes of me playing I think it was a dinosaur, I would go roar and he would run away. And then he would pause and look behind me to see if I was still chasing him. I would pause, give him that verbal prompt of chase. He would say a near approximation. It was pretty close, actually. And of course, I'm chasing him, picking him up, tickling him. All of this again in 15 minutes. He's having some of his new first mans to chase me. A kid that was regularly eloping from his parents, very obviously to just play the game chase. But here you have just a natural moment to work on those mans. And really, that's what ESDM is all about. Of course, a lot of those targets, because we were working with a new kiddo, I was just pulling them out um, from thin air, really, just because I had assessed the child and I was just covering for the moment. We didn't have as much data in yet because it was just his first few days. But I was just pulling those out of thin air. But a BCBA can just map that directly on to the client and just label it NET so that the staff know not to run it at the table. The most difficult part, and I think we can all admit this at this point, is that running targets like that takes a great deal of practice with your staff. So this is a skill that really you do have to model, BCBA, so please don't be embarrassed about getting in there and showing off your play skills and your natural NET skills. I think that should be our biggest bragging rights as BCBAs, is that we can just pull things right out of thin air and start working on them, because we have in our head these like thousands of assessment data points that we can think through and measure right there in the moment. So take that skill and show it off to your students. That way they can start to understand how to contrive it with your RBTs. I'm the director of clinical operations for my clinic. Yeah, I promise you right now, I have no problem jumping in, getting my hands dirty, and showing what good play skills, what good NET should truly look like. And of course, as BCBAs, we have all those assessments running in the back of our mind almost all the time, but many of us are missing the critical developmental stages of early childhood. We are not experts of early child development. We have our VB map, but that is nowhere near the level of which the ESDM curriculum guides us. So if there is one thing that I would love for you guys to actually pull from this, is use the ESDM curriculum. If nothing else, use the ESDM curriculum. All right, guys, we're going to pause right there for just a second. And your second key word of the episode is natural. That's NATURAL. Natural. All right, so we've talked about a lot. We've talked about the importance of NDBI. We've talked about naturalistic teaching. We talk about the developmental curriculums out there and how those are so important for us BCBAs who oftentimes lack these developmental knowledge and skill sets that are required to truly teach in this age group. But let's start to move into what can we actually take from NDBI and start applying it in our sessions starting Monday mornings, right? And obviously, I'm going to come back to the assessment and goal selection, because everything else depends on that foundation. One of the big themes in NDBI literature is that we should be prioritizing the developmental building blocks that actually support later language and learning, especially joint attention imitation, shared affects, and early social engagement. This is something that I see so often missed, joint attention especially, so often missed in our field. NDBIs deliberately target the full range of developmental domains, but do it in a way that integrates skills across domains rather than teaching them in isolation. They specifically highlight joint attention and imitation as precursors that enhance later achievement like language, and argue that focusing on those foundational skills is often more effective than hammering verbal imitation in a vacuum. So, when you're doing your intake, your baseline, your first few sessions, I want you to ask yourself, how is this child doing in those core areas? How is their joint attention? How is their imitation? Do they spontaneously share attention with you, even for a second, by looking between you and something interesting? Do they ever point something out just to show you, not just to get it? Do they imitate simple actions with objects or body movements? Do they imitate sounds in a way, even if it's not clear speech, but they're trying? How do they play? Are they exploring and baying? Are they lining up? Are they pretending? Are they inviting anyone into that? You can absolutely use formal tools to help with this. An ESDM curriculum checklist, again, if you get nothing else from this, use that. But you also do have parts of the VB map that work on joint attention and, of course, imitation and play. But the difference is that nobody in the VB map is telling you work on those first. Those are so critical for that early intervention developmental building block stages. And I really wish that somebody would have told me this in grad school, because here's the reality. When you target behaviors out of developmental sequence, you tend to get poor progress. But when you build on the social pragmatic foundations of language and engagement, learning is more efficient. So instead of saying, well, the parents really want him to name colors, so we'll do it big DTT style, we might say at this point, he doesn't yet look back and forth between me and the things he cares about. Let's start by building joint attention and simple imitation inside play, and we'll get to color labeling down the road. Those joint attention and imitation goals still go on the data sheet. They're still operationally defined. They're just chosen because the developmental research says they're the backbone. They're the bricks for everything else that's going to be coming. So please, guys, go and get a developmental curriculum checklist, whether that's ESDM or one of the other dozen NDBIs curriculum guides out there. Please just use one of them. If you don't ever actually assess a child, at least you have that information in front of you. The next thing you can really start to work on is moving your DTT programs into an NDBI style teaching, moving them into NET. I'm not saying you burn your entire discrete trial binder. I'm not telling you to take all those programs that you've worked on for years now and just throw them out the window. Table time still has a place, but you should start asking yourself, how could I do this in a more naturalistic way? Take listener responding of body parts or just common objects. Instead of placing them in front of the client with these 2D pictures and saying, point to the elbow on the kid in the picture. Of course, you're not going to say it like that, but point to the elbow or point to the cat or point to the ball. Take the kiddo away from the table and actually have them go find a ball. Have them go find red in the clinic like a scavenger hunt. Go have them find their elbow on their own body part. And do it in a fun game way. I mean, head, shoulders, knees and toes, knees and toes. If you can't incorporate that into your receptive ID of body parts programs, I mean, come on, that's the whole point of that song, right, guys? So let's take advantage of those natural occurring fun activities that we can do to teach a child. And here's the thing, BCBAs, we have an immense amount of creative leeway with our programming. You don't have to do things the way that you were trained to do them. We don't have to continue being the DTT fashion BCBAs anymore. We can move past that. You have creative freedom. Write programs that describe to the RBTs exactly how to make these sort of situations come up, because the reality is this is the biggest area where RBTs struggle. This is the area where they get trapped and they get stuck, because contriving opportunities to do NET is honestly difficult. I've been doing this for years at this point, and every once in a while I still struggle with trying to figure out a natural way to get a child to imitate me. I mean, these are not always easy things to be doing. It takes practice, it takes creativity, it takes imagination to come up with how we can run some of these goals. Alright guys, before we start to wrap up, I'm going to give you your final CEU word for this episode. Your third key word is connection. Connecting to the kiddos, right guys? That's CONNECTION. Connection. Alright guys, as we start to come to the end of this episode, I want to pull us back up to the big picture for a minute. We've covered a lot. We defined what naturalistic developmental behavior interventions actually are. We talked through the research. We zoomed in on the early start Denver model as a concept example, and then we spent some time on what this looks like when you're on the floor with a real kid on a Tuesday afternoon. So let's tie that together. At the heartbeat of NDBI are exactly what the name says they are: naturalistic developmental behavior interventions. They're not anti-ABA, they are ABA plus developmental science. They're grounded in the same operant principles we already use: antecedents, behaviors, consequences, reinforcement, prompting, shaping. But instead of centering their whole identity around table time and compliance, they put the spotlight on how young children actually develop. They happen in natural settings: living rooms, playgrounds, preschools, and therapy rooms that look like daycares and schools. They're built on shared control where child's choice and interests actually matter and drive what you do. And most important, they focus on developmentally important skills: joint attention, imitation, play, and early language and social engagement in the order that they naturally develop. Because we know those are bricks everything else is built on. But I think the most important takeaway isn't that you have to be an ESDM clinic, or that you need to go and get certified in Jasper, or that you need to memorize all the differences in NDBI. The most important takeaway is that there are shared elements that are already researched and proven that we can incorporate right now. Just like we all started with the VB map by doing research on it, by watching how it was ran, by using it, we can do the same thing with ESDM curriculum checklists or the other curriculums out there, and to start to move those developmental programming into our own practices. You can look at your environments, your clinics, your home environments that you're working in, and start to ask yourself, do these environments entice the child to use communication that require them to go through an adult to get access to things? And you can look at the reinforcement systems and ask, does this make sense for the child from their point of view? While we all love a good token board, it doesn't really make sense that after identifying a cat or a dog or a ball, that they get a token and not a cat or a dog or a ball. That doesn't mean you go and throw it away. Trust me, I love my token boards, don't get me wrong. But the reality is that we need to move away from those things as quickly as possible and build in naturalistic reinforcements that are actually going with what's going on in the world. If a child is labeling those things naturally, or if they're happening to be echoing you as you're labeling it, that is a heck of a lot more natural to be getting a praise and a high five or, whoa, you're so smart praise, than it is to be getting a token, right? You don't need a permission slip from anyone to make ABA more naturalistic and more compassionate. All right, guys, before we wrap up, I want to quickly remind you this podcast is ACE approved to provide CEUs, and this CEU episode is worth 1 CEU credit. When you're ready to grab that CEU for this episode, head over to aba-ceus.com. Find this episode, NDBIs episode 7, in the Get CEUs tab. You'll purchase the CEUs there by adding it to your cart. And after you fill in those 3 keywords, you will receive your certificate in about 24 hours. I hand check or visually check every single purchase to make sure that the wording is correct before I send it out. Now, a small favor. If you listen to this and thought of a specific colleague, the one who still says ABA means table time all the time, or the one who's curious about more naturalistic work but doesn't know where to start, send this episode to them. Text it to them, drop it in their Teams chat or their Slack chat. And if you thought this episode was good, leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. Every little comment really helps. All right, that's where we leave it for today. Thanks for spending this hour with me and for the work you're doing for the kids and families we serve. I'm Jay Burton, and as always, thanks for going beyond the data.
Bye, see you next time.